hello. It's fancy seeing you here. I feel like we see each other every time I'm in my room. Now, I think we were reading our story, and I'm going to get it from my bag. Now, it's so beautiful outside. Have you seen the weather? Sunny, beautiful, warm. Makes me want to go for a bit of a ride of some sort, I think. Well, let's see. It was in here. Let's see. Well, that's not it. Although, if you have not read Frog and Toad, it is one of the best books I've ever read, other than my own. Let's see. Maybe something fell out. Nope. Oh, goodness. It's really... Do you know where Joe Clark is? Apparently I had a coffee mug in there. I'll have to have a little bit of tea later. All right, come on. Oh, goodness. What is this? Slytherin. That's not it either. You'd think by now I'd have it down pat where my things were in my bag. Oh, what is this? Oh, goodness. I don't know what that's for. It's got to be in here somewhere. One sock. That's not it. There it is. You'd think by now I would have a hold of my bag. Now, if you remember, the book is Mary Poppins by P.L. Travers. Now, it's very important I also share with you, it's illustrated by Mary Shepard, and it was published by Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt in Boston, New York. I've never been. Maybe one day I will. Now I'm going to pull you close, and we're going to read our third chapter of the book. I believe it is called, yes, Laughing Gas, and I can't wait to see what's in store. Now I hope you're ready to read Laughing Gas, Chapter 3. Now Bert and I got into some mischief the last chapter, but I feel like Jane and Michael are going to get into quite some trouble this chapter. Are you quite sure he will be home? Said Jane as they got off the bus, she and Michael and Mary Poppins. Would my uncle ask me to bring you to tea if he intended to go out? I'd like to know, said Mary Poppins, who was evidently very offended by the question. She was wearing her blue coat with silver buttons and a blue hat to match. And on the days where she wore these, it was the easiest thing in the world to offend her. Not true. All three of them were on the way to pay a visit to Mary Poppins' uncle, Mr. Wigg, and Jane and Michael had looked forward to the trip for so long that they were more than half afraid that Mr. Wigg might not be in, after all. Why is he called Mr. Wigg? Does he wear one? Said Michael, hurrying along beside Mary Poppins. He's called Mr. Wigg because Mr. Wigg is his name. And he doesn't wear one, Michael. He's bald, said Mary Poppins. And if I have any more questions, we will just go back to home. And she sniffed her unusual sniff of displeasure. Jane and Michael looked at each other and frowned, and the frown meant, don't ask her anything else, or we'll never get there. Mary Poppins put her hat straight at the tobacconist's shop at the corner. It was one of those curious windows where there seemed to be three of you instead of one, so that if you look long enough at them, you begin to feel as if you're not yourself, but a whole crowd of somebody else. Mary Poppins sighed with pleasure. However, when she saw three of herself, each wearing a blue coat with silver buttons and a blue hat to match, she thought it was such a lovely sight that she wished She wished there had been a dozen or even 30 more of her. The more Mary Poppins, the better. "Come along," she said sternly, as though they had kept her waiting. Then they turned the corner and pulled the bell of number 3 Robertson Road. Jane and Michael could hear it faintly echoing from a long ways away, and they knew that in 1 minute or 2 at the most, they would be having tea with Mary Poppins' uncle, Mr. Wigg, for the first time ever. "If he's in, of course," said Jane to Michael in a whisper. At that moment the door flew open and a thin, watery-looking lady appeared. "Is he in?" Michael said quickly. "Oh, thank you," said Mary Poppins, giving him a terrible glance. "Let me do the talking." "How do you do, Mrs. Wigg?" said Jane politely. "Mrs. Wigg," said the thin lady in a voice even thinner than herself. "How dare you call me Mrs. Wigg? No, thank you. I'm Mrs. Persimmon, and proud of it. Mrs. Wigg, indeed." She seemed to be upset, and they thought Mr. Wigg must have been a very odd person if Miss Persimmons was so glad not to be Mrs. Wigg. "Straight up and first door on the landing," said Miss Persimmons, and she went hurrying down the passage, saying, "Mrs. Wigg, indeed," to herself in a high, thin, outraged voice. Jane and Michael followed Mary Poppins upstairs. Mary Poppins knocked at the door. Come in, welcome," called a loud, cheery voice from inside. Jane's heart was pitter-pattering with excitement. "He is in," she signaled to Michael with a look. Mary Poppins opened the door and pushed them in front of her. A large, cheerful room laid before them. At one end of it, a fire was burning brightly, and in the center stood an enormous table laid for tea, 4 cups and saucers, piles of bread and butter, crumpets, coconut cakes, and a large plum cake with pink icing. "Well, this is indeed a pleasure," a huge voice greeted them, and Jane and Michael looked around for the owner of the voice. He was nowhere to be seen. The room appeared to be quite empty. They heard Mary Poppins saying crossly, "Oh, Uncle Albert, not again. It's not your birthday, is it?" And as she spoke, she looked up at the ceiling. Jane and Michael looked up too, and to their surprise, saw a round, fat, bald man who was hanging in the air without holding on to anything. Indeed, he appeared to be sitting on the air, for his legs were crossed, and he had just put down the newspaper which he had been reading when they came in. "My dear," said Mr. Wigg, smiling down at the children, and he looked apologetically at Mary Poppins. "I'm very sorry, but I'm afraid it is my birthday." "Tsk, tsk, tsk, tsk," said Mary Poppins. "I only remembered last night, and there was no time then to send you a postcard asking you to come another time. Very distressing, isn't it?" he said, looking down at Jane and Michael. "I can see you're rather surprised," said Mr. Wigg, and indeed their mouths were so wide with astonishment that Mr. Wigg, if he had been a little smaller, might have fallen into one of them. "I'd better explain, I think," Mr. Wigg went on calmly. "You see, it's this way. I'm a cheerful sort of man, and very disposed to laughter. You wouldn't believe me, either of you, the number of things that strike me as being funny. I can laugh at pretty nearly everything I can." And with that, Mr. Wigg began to bob up and down, shaking with laughter at the thought of his own cheerfulness. "Oh, Uncle Albert," said Mary Poppins, and Mr. Wigg stopped laughing with a jerk. "Oh, beg your pardon, my dear. Where was I? Oh, yes. Well, the funny thing about me is, all right, Mary, I won't laugh if I can help it, that whenever my birthday falls on a Friday, well, it's all up with me. Absolutely up, said Mr. Wigg. "But why?" began Jane. "But how?" began Michael. "Well, you see, if I laugh on a particular day, I become so filled with laughing gas that I simply can't keep on the ground. Even if I smile, it happens. The first funny thought, and I'm up like a balloon. And until I can think of something serious, I can't get down." Mr. Wigg began to chuckle at that, and he caught sight of Mary Poppins' face, and stopped the chuckle and continued. "It's awkward, of course, but not unpleasant. Never happens to either of you, I suppose?" Jane and Michael shook their heads. "No, I thought not. It seems to be my own special habit. Once, after I'd been to the circus the night before, I laughed so much, would you believe it, I was up here for a whole 12 hours and couldn't get down to the last stroke of midnight. Then, of course, I came down with a flop because it was Saturday and not my birthday anymore. It's rather odd, isn't it? Not to say funny. And now here it is Friday again and my birthday. And you too and Mary P. came to visit. Oh, lordy, lordy, don't make me laugh, I beg of you." But both, although Jane and Michael had done nothing very amusing except for stare at him in astonishment. Mr. Wig began to laugh again loudly. As he laughed, he went bouncing and bobbing about in the air, with that newspaper rattling in his hand, and his spectacles half up on his nose. He looked so comic, floundering in the air like a great human bubble, clutching at the ceiling sometimes, and sometimes as the gas bracket as he passed, that Jane and Michael, though they were trying hard to be polite, just couldn't help doing what they did. They laughed and laughed. They shut their mouths tight to prevent the laughter escaping, but that didn't do them any good. And presently they were rolling over and over and over on the floor, squealing and shrieking with laughter. "Really," said Mary Poppins, "really such behaviour?" "I can't help it," shrieked Michael as he rolled into the fender. "It's so terribly funny. Oh, isn't it funny, Jane?" Jane didn't respond, for a curious thing was happening to her. As she laughed, she felt herself growing lighter and lighter, just as though she were being pumped full of air. It was a curious and delicious feeling, and made her want to laugh all the more. And then suddenly, with a bouncing bound, she felt herself jumping through the air. Michael, to his astonishment, saw her going soaring up through the room, with a little bump on her head touching the ceiling, and then she went bouncing along till she reached Mr. Wig. "Well," said Mr. Wig, looking very surprised indeed, "don't tell me it's your birthday too." Jane shook her head. "It's not? Then this laughing gas must be catching. Hi, whoa there, look out for the masterpiece." This was to Michael, who suddenly risen from the floor and was swooping through the air, roaring with laughter, and just grazing the china ornaments on the mantelpiece as he had passed. He landed with a bounce right on Mr. Wig's knee. "How d'you do?" said Mr. Wig, heartily shaking Michael by the hand. "I call this really friendly of you, bless my soul I do, to come up to me since I couldn't come down to you." And then he and Michael looked at each other and flung back their heads and simply howled in laughter. "I say," said Mr. Wig to Jane as he wiped his eyes, "you'll be thinking I have the worst manners in the world. You're standing and you ought to be sitting, a nice young lady like you. I'm afraid I can't offer a chair to you, but I think you'll find the air quite comfortable to sit on. I know I do." Jane tried it and found she could sit quite comfortably on a chair. She took off her hat and laid it down beside her, and hung there in space without any support at all. "That's right," said Mr. Wig. Then he turned and looked at Mary Poppins. "Well, Mary, we're fixed, and now I can inquire about you, my dear. I must say I'm very glad to welcome you to my two young friends here today. Why, Mary, you're frowning, and I'm afraid you don't approve of, all of this." He waved his hand at Jane and Michael and said hurriedly, "I apologize, Mary dear, but you know how it is with me. Still, I must say I never thought my two young friends would catch it. I really didn't, Mary. I suppose I should have asked them for another day, or tried to think of something sad or something." "Well, I must say," Mary Poppins said primly, "that I've never in my life seen such a sight, and at your age, Uncle Albert." Mary Poppins. "Please, Mary Poppins, come up," interrupted Michael. "Think of something funny and you'll find it quite easy." "Ah, now do, Mary Poppins," Mr. Wig said persuasively. "We're lonely up here without you," said Jane, and held out her arms towards Mary Poppins. "Do you think something's funny?" "Ah, she doesn't want to," said Mr. Wig, sighing. She can come up if she wants to, even without laughing, and she knows it. and he looked mysteriously and secretly at Mary Poppins as she stood down there on the rug. "Well," said Mary Poppins, "it's all very silly and undignified, but since you're all up there and don't seem to be coming down, I suppose I better come up too." With that, to the surprise of Jane and Michael, she put her hand down at her side, and without a laugh, without even the faintest glimmer of a smile, she shot up through the air and sat down beside Jane. "How many times, I should like to know," she said snappily, "have I told you to take off your coat when you came into a hot room?" And she unbuttoned Jane's coat and laid it neatly on the air beside the hat. "That's right, Mary, that's right," said Mr. Wig. He leaned down and put his spectacles on the mantelpiece. "Now we're all comfortable." "There's comfort and there's comfort," said Mary Poppins. "And we could have tea," Mr. Wiggs went on, apparently not noticing her remark. And then a startled look came over his face. "My goodness," he said, "how dreadful! I just realized that the table's down there and we're up here. What are we going to do? We're here and there. It's awfully tragic, awfully awful, but oh, it's terribly hilarious." And he hid his face in his handkerchief and loudly laughed into it. Jane and Michael, though, they didn't want to miss the crumpets and the cakes, and couldn't help but laughing too, because Mr. Wig's mirth was so infectious. Mr. Wig dried his eyes. "There's only one thing for it," he said. "We must think of something serious, something sad, something very sad, and then we'll be able to get down. Now, 1, 2, 3, something very sad, mind you." They thought and they thought, with their chins on their hands. Michael thought of school, and that one day he would have to go back. But even that seemed funny today, and he started to laugh. Jane thought, "I'll be a grown-up in another 14 years. But that didn't sound so sad at all. Actually quite nice and rather funny. She couldn't stop smiling at the thought of herself grown up with long skirts and a handbag. There was my poor old Aunt Emily, thought Mr. Wig. She was run over by an omnibus. Sad, very sad, unbearably sad. Poor Aunt Emily. But they saved her umbrella. That was funny, wasn't it? And before he knew where he was heaving and trembling and bursting with laughter at the thought of Aunt Emily's umbrella. "No good," he said, blowing his nose. "I'll give it up, and my young friends here seem to be no better at sadness than I am. Mary, can't you do something? We want our tea." To this day, Jane and Michael can't be sure of what happened. All they know for certain is that as soon as Mr. Wig had appealed to Mary Poppins, the table began to wiggle on its legs. Presently it was swaying dangerously, and then with a rattle of china and with cakes lurching off of the plates on the cloth, the table came soaring through the room, gave one graceful turn, and landed beside them, so Mr. Wig was at the head of the table. "Good girl," said Mr. Wig, smiling proudly upon her. "I knew you'd fix something. Now, will you take the foot of the table and pour out, Mary? And the guests on either side, that's the idea," he said, as Michael ran bobbing through the air and sat down on Mr. Wig's right. Jane was at his left. There they were all together up in the air at the table between them. Not a single piece of bread and butter or lump of sugar had been left behind. Mr. Wig smiled. "It is unusual, I think, to begin with bread and butter," he said to Jane and Michael, "but it's my birthday, and we will begin the wrong way today, which I always think is the right way, with the cake." And he cut a large slice for everyone. "More tea?" he said to Jane, but before she had time to reply, there was a quick, sharp knock at the door. "Come in," called Mr. Wig. The door opened, and there stood Miss Persimmons with a jug of hot water on a tray. "I thought, Mr. Wig," she began, searching around the room, "you'd be wanting some more hot—" "Well, I simply never," she said as she caught sight of them all seated around the table in the air. "Such goings-on I never did see. In all my born days I've never such awe. I'm sure, Mr. Wig, I always knew you were a bit odd, but I closed my eyes to it, being being as you paid your rent regular, but such behaviour as this, having tea in the air with guests, Mr. Wiggs, sir, I'm astonished at you. It's that undignified, and for a gentleman of your age, I never did. But perhaps you will, Miss Persimmons, said Michael. Will what? Said Miss Persimmons. Catch the laughing-gas we did, said Michael. Miss Persimmons flung back her head scornfully. I hope, young man, she retorted, I have more respect for myself than to go bouncing about in the air like a rubber ball at the end of a bat. I'll stay on my own feet, thank you, or my name's not Amy Persimmon. And oh dear, oh my goodness dear, what is the matter? I can't walk. Oh, help, help! For Miss Persimmon, quite against her will, was off the ground and was stumbling through the air, rolling from side to side like a thin barrel, balancing her tray in hand. She was almost weeping with distress when she arrived at the table and put down her jug of hot water. Thank you, said Mary Poppins in a very kind, polite voice. Then Miss Persimmon turned and went wafting down again, murmuring as she went, So undignified, and me a well-behaved, steady-going woman. I must see a doctor. When she touched the floor, she ran hurriedly out of the room, wringing her hands and not giving a single glance back. So undignified, they heard her moaning as she shut the door behind her. Her name can't be Amy Persimmons, because she didn't stay on her own 2 feet, whispered Jane to Michael. But Mr. Wigg was looking at Mary Poppins, a curious look, half amused, half accusing. Mary, Mary, you shouldn't, bless my soul, you shouldn't, Mary. The poor old body will never get over it, but oh my goodness, did she look funny waddling through the air. My gracious goodness, but didn't she? And he and Jane and Michael were off again, rolling through the air, clutching at her sides and gasping with laughter at the thought of how funny Miss Persimmons had looked. Oh dear, said Michael, don't make me laugh any more. I can't stand it. I think I'll break. Oh, said Jane as she gasped for breath, with her hand over her heart. Oh, my gracious, glorious, galumphing goodness, said Mr. Wiggs, dabbing his eye with the tail of his coat, because he couldn't find another handkerchief. It's time to go home, Mary Poppins sounded above the roars of laughter like a trumpet, and suddenly with a rush, Jane and Michael and Mr. Wiggs came down. They landed on the floor with a huge bump altogether. The thought that they would have to go home was the first sad thought of the afternoon, and the moment it was in their minds, the laughing-gas went out of them. Jane and Michael sighed as they watched Mary Poppins come slowly down in the air, carrying Jane's coat and hat. Mr. Wiggs sighed too, a great, long, heavy sigh. Well, isn't that a pity? He said soberly. It's very sad that you've got to go home. I've never enjoyed an afternoon so much, did you? Never, said Michael sadly, feeling how dull it was to be down on earth again, with no laughing-gas inside. Never, never, said Jane as she stood on tiptoe and kissed Mr. Wiggs' withered apple cheeks. Never, 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 ever. They sat on either side of Mary Poppins going home in the bus. They were both very quiet, thinking over the lovely afternoon. Presently Michael said sleepily to Mary Poppins, How often does your uncle get like that? Like what? Said Mary Poppins sharply, as though Michael had deliberately said something to offend her. Well, all that bouncy and boundy and laughing and going up in the air. Up in the air? Mary Poppins' voice was high and angry. What do you mean, pray, up in the air? Jane tried to explain. Michael means, is your uncle often full of laughing-gas, and does he often go rolling and bobbing about on the ceiling? When rolling and bobbing? What an idea! Rolling and bobbing on the ceiling. You tell me next he's a balloon. Mary Poppins gave an offended sniff. But he did, said Michael. We saw him. What, roll and bob? How dare you? I'll have you know my uncle is a sober, honest, hard-working man, and you'll be very kind to speak to him respectfully. And don't bite your bus ticket. Roll and bob indeed, the idea. Michael and Jane looked across Mary Poppins at each other. They said nothing, for they last learned that it was better not to argue with Mary Poppins, no matter how odd something seemed. But the look that passed between them said, "Is it true, or isn't it, about Mr. Wig? Is Mary Poppins right, or are we?" The bus roared on, wildly lurching and bounding. Mary Poppins sat between them, offended and silent, and presently, because they were very tired, they crept closer to her and leaned up against her sides and fell asleep, still wondering. That's the picture from the chapter. That's it for our chapter today. I need to get my hat fixed. It's just not staying. I think it's because I was wearing the other hat during my adventure, and this one was in my bag, and I think it got a little crumpled. The next chapter is called Miss Lark's Andrew, and we will read that next time. I hope you all enjoyed our story, and I hope to see you next time. Have a great day and enjoy the weather outside. It's beautiful. Go and enjoy the lovely weather we have. Until next time.